I have a question for Daniel on the social practice theory. I would agree that it's an important way to look at the problems, the social context and habits and so on. But when you described practitia and portfolio, I thought it was difficult to see myself as a practitia. I would say that I'm probably 80 to 90% portfolio and 10 to 20% practitia. So I'm wondering, how do you see, because you mentioned it's not black and white, it's not one theory over the other, but it's a certain mix of theories. And the second question I have is also for Daniel. It's about perceived behavioral control as in relation to this vision one can have on the practitia versus portfolio scale. That can be made such a scale. Thanks.
I think the if I understand the question right, I mean, I think the key point that I'm trying to make is that when we look at practitia and portfolio, who are obviously doing exactly the same thing in the morning, the difficulty is that so much of the way in which sustainable consumption is framed, so much of the policy initiatives, so much of our thinking around it, just assumes a model of behaviour which only accounts. It's not to say that it doesn't exist. I could decide to get up now and walk out. You know, I'm not without autonomy. But the point that I'm trying to make, and the point that the practice theory position makes, is that we shouldn't take that as a paradigm for human activity, because we need a much more expansive understanding of how human activity comes about, how it's conditioned, and so on. And the difficulty is that this implicit model, it mischaracterizes, so it misrepresents the way in which much human activity, much behaviour happens. And of course it plays into particular political agendas. So in putting responsibility on individuals, what generally happens is that responsibility is taken away from governments, collective institutions, and so forth. So I think, in a way, to me, there are two most significant things. One is not to see this little slice of behaviour as the paradigm of all human behaviour, but the other is to recognise the political effects of characterising social practices as individualised, as voluntaristic, and so on, because it has a profoundly political effect. And we'd certainly see it very much in the UK, where government policy continually focuses on individual behaviours and individual attitudes in a way in which it just puts out of the question, it puts out of the frame other more challenging political and social issues which are about stronger forms of sustainable consumption. So I hope that answers the question a bit.
You take away responsibility from the government if you focus on individual choice, but you also take away the responsibility of consumers if you think they're just doing habits in a social context.
Okay, yeah, sure. But I mean, perhaps it's easier to put it through an example. Okay, so I've just done a project on household food waste, which food waste is a big issue across Europe at the moment. It's a kind of hot topic. And you might ask the question, who's responsible for household food waste? Well, if you look at the figures, if you look at food waste across the supply chain, obviously householders are responsible for household food waste. But if you look at figures across the supply chain, retailers, supermarkets, are only responsible for about 5% of direct food waste. And householders are responsible for about 45%. So we can ask who's responsible here. And the obvious thing to say is, well, individuals are, householders are. And the obvious corollary of that is to say, well, how do we change their behaviours? Well, they don't, we need to change people's attitudes. We need to change people's attitudes to waste. If you actually look at why people waste food in their houses and what people think about wasting food, almost universally, people think wasting food is wrong. Okay? I'm not saying that there aren't things that people can improve in the way that they go about stuff to not waste food, but the reasons that people waste food in households are more to do with cultural conventions and routines than they are lack of care about food. So in our research, and we've done survey research, big survey research on this as well, it's not just qualitative research, what you find is that there's much more food wasted if, for example, that meals are more socially significant. So there's a conflicting convention between we want people to eat meals with each other, we think that's a social good, but if people, the more the socially significant the meal is, if you eat with family, if you eat with friends, the more food is likely to be wasted. Okay, so one thing to say there is that there's conflicting conventions which lead to food waste. But another aspect of this is that we can see ways in which food waste is transferred, if you like, from retailers to householders. So people don't have complete control over the kind of portions in which they buy food, and retailers' marketing activities, so promotional activities, can encourage overconsumption. So what you find with food waste is that the causes of food waste and the location of where food is wasted are not necessarily the same place. So, I mean, I just use that as an example to show where even something that seemingly is self-evidently the problem of individuals in their homes, that they should have responsibility for, is part of a wider system where there's responsibility distributed through that. Ultimately, people have responsibility for throwing food away, but it's in the context of a much wider system.
The question was, if you want to steer a community to go from the Mickey Mouse concept to the strong sustainability, should you first pass in monopoly terms over the weak sustainability, or should you put your effort in going straight away from unsustainable to the strong sustainability?
So my plea, is the micro on? So my plea or my argumentation would always be to go towards the strong sustainable consumption immediately, knowing that this is not possible. But I don't think, I think we have done for too long time trying to show one step after the other, hoping it will lead us to the right direction. This is going too slow. We don't have the time anymore. You have to have clear information where to end. And then people will compromise, and then others will come and make it difficult for you, whatever. But hoping for the spillover effect, start with the slow steps. We tried that too long.
For an individual, that's a big step. So go from
for humanity.
Yeah. Bigger.
Mankind.
Yes, I know. But the things have to be clear.
Does it suggest that you also, in fact, really somewhat in this the idea of a sovereign consumer who can make this choice?
No, as you have seen, I've not talked too much about the individuals. I'm coming from the political angle. I've worked for NGOs, I've worked with governments, I've worked with decision makers. Brings me to this context. So what's the point if you are at an international conference and the representative of your government says, what can we do if the consumers don't want? So I think that's their job to do something. They are steering us all the time in a direction, but they don't want to go in this direction. I don't know why. So I see the problem, but be clear. We have to be clear.
Thank you. I have a question for Sylvia. First of all, I like very much your presentation because it was very clear and you pointed towards some solutions. But I would like to jump to your slide with the impact formula.
Yeah. Oh, I can tell you which one it is. No, I can't tell you.
That's a well-known formula. If you look at it, it seems to suggest that you have to minimize technology to minimize the impact on the environment, because population is growing, people want to be affluent.
Go on.
Okay. But somebody else defined another formula later on, suggesting that you could use technology to minimize the impact, which means that you have to look for a new technology, and you put the T in the denominator of the formula. You can use more technology, for example, now developing solar energy, wind turbines, is a way of using technology to minimize the impact on the environment. And there was another factor that just asking your opinion about it, because I think changing that formula would also explain a lot of things in your second to last slide. The happiness of people, making people happy with what they have, especially when we speak about the middle income classes, not having to want more, but making, let's say, making them happy with what they have. If you put that element of happiness also in the formula, it becomes something completely different.
Let's start from the technology.
Yeah.
Yes. Can technology solve the problem? That's your last slide.
Yeah.
If you find the right technology, which means that you need more technology, then you put it in the denominator. If it can solve, it stands on top.
But this is exactly the problem. Do you find the technology who solves the problems? And this is not for granted.
That's true.
Yeah,
This formula suggests that you need less technology.
No. You can have a minus. You can have the technology is not.
It says that impact is a function of
it's a function.
But it doesn't.
So you can have technology which needs more resources. You can invent technology which needs less resources. But then, with the growth rate and with the affluence, even with the technology which needs less resources, it might go up because of the rebound effect and all these things. That's the argument, and I haven't heard something which is challenging or really against it. Is that okay? Can we discuss the happiness afterwards? Because that sounds interesting.
We talk about less consumption a lot, but aren't our governments scared to death that we will consume less? A few years ago, I wrote an article that we live in a fancy fair economy, that we consume for a good cause, the welfare state. And that's what the problem is. Our governments don't see an alternative.
Yeah, I fully agree what to say to that. You are right. Our governments are scared to death. So if you look into newspapers, it's about growth, and growth will make us happy, which is proven not clear.
Clearly, we live in an economic system where there is no equilibrium. I mean, we can't degrow without experiencing, effects of depression and recession and so forth. So we're faced with a really fundamental problem that the economic, we cannot control, we can't reduce consumption in the way in which we need to in environmental terms, within the current economic system. It's just not possible. So, I mean, there's not a simple answer to that, but by any means, but it does suggest that if you're talking about, if you're taking a systemic approach to questions of sustainable consumption, you have to confront issues of finance capital. You have to confront the fact that until finance capital is constrained democratically by governments, at least to the degree at which it was at the end of the Second World War, there's absolutely no way that we can achieve a transition towards sustainability, because finance capital will always militate towards short-term profits at the cost of environmental goods. So, there's just to say that's got to be part of a systemic approach to sustainable consumption, in my view.
Yeah, we have to challenge this approach, because it is totally clear we will come to a sustainable society sooner or later, either voluntarily, we can try to have a soft landing in such a situation, or it will come over us. Maybe after some wars, or maybe after some else. In the end, humanity will live sustainable again. So the second, more positive answer is that there are quite a lot of good, intelligent, knowledgeable people working to answer that question and to find ways in the degrowth community, which is not only a group of people trying to live voluntary lifestyles, but also researchers, also scientists, trying to deal with exactly the questions the politics is always posing to us. But just, we have to allow ourselves to think that the economic system as it is now is not a God-given thing. And I think most governments, supported by lobbyists, whoever, don't want to get to that point. And we have to bring them to that point.
I would suggest another answer, which was also perhaps in one of the discourses, which is that if you want to change policy, you have to follow political strategies and not just consumption-oriented strategies. So you have to work on political
we agree on that.
Yes. Debate, opposition, social movements, and so on. Okay, I have just one more question for you then. I'm always fascinated. I think it's a very, very, very interesting perspective that you bring in, and discussion with Ben also again. And your example of food waste, and I always think, what are you going to answer? And then I think, okay, another perspective. One of my questions always is, and I always had the impression that practice approaches stay relatively soft on what are really policy options. Does policy suggestions that you have really differ from, and in what sense do they then really differ from policy options you would get from other approaches?
I don't think there's a simple linear relationship between academic discourse and policy. And I'm not really bothered whether policy uses the language of practice theory or uses the concepts. What I'm bothered about is whether the wider, more significant aspects are taken up. So, I mean, we do have some examples in the UK. The Scottish government reframed its behaviour change policies around a system that they called ISM, the individual social material. I sort of obliquely, I referred to it a bit, sort of in passing in that, where what they did was they took a practice theoretical perspective that colleagues of mine at the Sustainable Consumption Institute developed, and they combined it with other perspectives. So they did combine it with psychological perspectives as well, to produce a kind of policy toolkit. And if anyone's interested, you can Google this. You can find it on the Scottish Government website, in which, rather than framing behaviour change in terms of the sovereign consumer, they still addressed individuals, but they also addressed social contexts and material contexts. So, I think there's a process of translation between academic research and policy, and there's no need for academics to kind of feel purist about how that gets translated. In some senses, a lot of what you're talking about in social practice theory is simply asking for a more holistic and a more contextual understanding of the focal thing that you're trying to address. So if you're trying to address an individual, what you might call an individual behaviour, or a just turning that language into a practice isn't going to do anything. But if you see that individual behaviour within its material context, within its social context, within a wider economic environment, then you're actually doing the kind of things that practice theory would advise you to do.
Well, we are at the end of our Studium Generale of 2016. I'm very delighted that we had two excellent speakers to end the Studium Generale this year. I can already say that we will have a new one next year. Next year our university exists for 200 years. And we will have a Studium Generale which focuses on what can a sustainable university mean in terms of research, education, and all activities that the university does. And then we'll start with a whole new university after that Studium Generale. Okay. What I take away from tonight, Sylvia, is that you said, in the end, we will live in a sustainable society. What the end was not so very clear, but this is the end now. And I remember the second thing, that there was going to be a lot of happiness after this. So I wish you all a good night, a lot of happiness. And I invite you to read papers, to read some of these texts, and of course, good exams. And come back next year for a new challenging Studium Generale. I also would like to thank Thomas